Imagine standing before the largest army the ancient world has ever seen. An endless sea of soldiers, horses, and weapons stretching as far as the eye can see. Now imagine being one of just 300 warriors chosen to face them. This is not fiction. This is the true story of the Battle of Thermopylae, where courage, strategy, and sacrifice collided to change the course of Western history. In 480 BC, the ancient world was about to witness one of the most unequal confrontations in history. Xerxes I, the powerful king of Persia, had assembled a colossal army with a single goal: to conquer Greece and avenge the defeat of his father, Darius I, at the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier. The numbers are staggering. While ancient estimates speak in the millions, modern historians estimate that Xerxes commanded between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, a truly massive army by the standards of the time. This force included Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Arabs, and many other peoples subjugated by the empire. It was the largest war machine ever assembled up to that point. Meanwhile, Greece was not a unified country, but a collection of independent, often rival city-states. Sparta and Athens were the most powerful, but even together, they seemed like ants before the Persian elephant. When news of the invasion arrived, panic spread. Many cities considered surrendering without a fight. Others sought refuge in their gods, consulting oracles on what to do. The Oracle of Delphi gave dark prophecies, speaking of destruction and death, but not everyone was willing to bow down. In Sparta, a military society where boys were trained for war from the age of 7, King Leonidas I made a decision that would echo through the centuries. Leonidas was no ordinary king. Around 60 years old, he was a veteran warrior, trained in the brutal Spartan educational system known as the agoge. He knew that facing the Persians in open field would be suicide. But he also knew there was one place where a small group of disciplined warriors could make a difference: the Thermopylae Pass. Thermopylae means hot gates in Greek, named for the region's hot springs. It was a narrow corridor between the mountains and the sea, so narrow that in some places only a chariot could pass. If the Greeks could hold this pass, they could neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. But there was a problem. It was the time of the religious festival of Carnea, and Spartan law prohibited warfare during this sacred period. Leonidas found a creative solution. He wouldn't take the entire army, only his personal guard of 300 Spartans, all fathers of sons, ensuring that their bloodlines would continue if they didn't return. It was August 480 BC when Leonidas set out from Sparta with his 300 elite warriors. But they weren't completely alone. Along the way, contingents from other Greek city-states joined: 700 from Thespiae, 400 from Thebes, and thousands more from various cities. In total, about 7,000 Greeks marched to Thermopylae. Arriving at the canyon, Leonidas immediately saw the strategic potential of the site. The path was so narrow that it would force the Persians to attack on small fronts, nullifying their numerical superiority. The mountains on one side and the sea on the other created a natural bottle, a deadly funnel where numbers would not matter as much as skill and discipline. The Greeks began to fortify their positions. They rebuilt an old Phocian wall that had been abandoned, creating an additional defensive point. They prepared for the approaching storm from the east. When they finally saw the Persian army approaching, the reality of the challenge became clear. These were not just soldiers, it was an entire nation on the move. Xerxes had brought not only warriors, but also servants, scribes, cooks, and even his harem. It was a display of power designed to intimidate as much as to conquer. But the Spartans were no ordinary men who could be easily intimidated. They had been conditioned from childhood to know no fear, to value honor above life, and to never ever retreat from the enemy. For them, dying in battle was the most glorious form of death. Flight was unthinkable. It was the greatest dishonor a Spartan could bear. When Xerxes' army finally appeared on the horizon, it must have been a terrifying spectacle. For days, the Persian soldiers continued to arrive, setting up camps that stretched for miles. The noise was deafening. Thousands of voices speaking dozens of different languages. Horses neighing, metal clashing against metal. Xerxes, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, waited 4 days before attacking. He sent a spy to observe the Spartans and received a bizarre report. The warriors were exercising and combing their long hair, seemingly unconcerned about the imminent threat. A Greek exile in the Persian court explained to Xerxes, "These are Spartans. When they comb their hair, they are preparing to die." It was a ritual, a mental and spiritual preparation for battle. Xerxes sent a messenger with a simple proposal: "Hand over your weapons." Leonidas' response went down in history: "Molon Labe, come and get them." Those 2 words perfectly captured the Spartan spirit: absolute defiance, unwavering courage, and a total refusal to submit. Xerxes, accustomed to seeing entire nations bow before his power, was furious. The Persian king made his first strategic mistake. Instead of waiting for his naval fleet to surround the Greeks or find another way through the mountains, he decided to simply crush the defenders with brute force. After all, what could 7,000 Greeks do against his immense army? He was about to find out. At dawn on the 5th day since the Persians' arrival, Xerxes launched his first attack. He sent the Medes, warriors from one of the Persian provinces, hoping that their numbers and ferocity would simply sweep the Greeks away. But Leonidas had turned the pass into a death trap. The Greek formation, known as a phalanx, was a virtually impenetrable wall when well executed. The Spartans stood shoulder to shoulder, their large round shields called hoplons overlapping, creating a wall of bronze. From behind the shields, long 8-foot spears protruded like the quills of a giant porcupine. When the Medes attacked, they were channeled through the narrow gorge, unable to exploit their numerical advantage. They crashed against the Spartan phalanx like waves against a rock. The long Greek spears pierced them before they could get close enough to use their own shorter weapons. The Spartans were not just soldiers, they were human war machines, the product of a lifetime of brutal training. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and subjected to the agoge, a military educational system that molded them into perfect warriors. They fought as a unit, each man trusting his life to the comrade beside him. Their armor was the finest in Greece: Corinthian bronze helmets that covered all but the eyes and mouth, muscular cuirasses, greaves protecting the legs. Most importantly, they possessed something most Persian soldiers lacked: iron discipline and superior technique. While many in the Persian army were newly drafted recruits from conquered peoples, fighting because they were forced to, each Spartan was a professional who had dedicated his entire life to the art of war. The first day's battle was a massacre. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers launched themselves against the Greek phalanx, and wave after wave were repelled. Bodies began to pile up in the narrow gorge, creating additional obstacles for subsequent attackers. Leonidas had developed a particularly clever tactic. Periodically, the Spartans feigned retreat, running as if fleeing in panic. The Persians, thinking they had finally broken the Greek line, pursued them in disarray, only for the Spartans to suddenly turn, reform their phalanx, and massacre the disorganized Persians. As the day wore on, Xerxes' frustration grew. He had sent thousands of men against a few hundred, and still could not break the defensive line. It is said that he rose from his throne 3 times during the battle, fearing the destruction of his army. Then Xerxes played his strongest card, the Immortals. The Immortals were the Persian elite guard, so called because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. When one fell, another immediately took his place, giving the impression that they were immortal. They were the finest warriors in the Persian Empire. equipped with the finest weapons and armor, veterans of countless campaigns. If anyone could break the Greeks, it would be them. But when the Immortals advanced against the Spartan phalanx, something extraordinary happened. They too were repelled. Persia's legendary elite warriors, undefeated in countless battles, met their match and discovered they were no match for Spartan discipline, technique, and ferocity. The fundamental difference lay in fighting style. The Persians relied on bows and short spears, tactics that worked wonderfully in open ground where they could flank and surround the enemy. But in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, these tactics were useless. They were forced to fight hand to hand, where the Greeks reigned supreme. By the time the sun set on the first day of battle, the floor of the pass was strewn with Persian corpses. Xerxes had lost thousands of men and had gained not an inch of territory. The Greeks, on the other hand, had suffered minimal losses. That night, around their fires, the Spartans didn't celebrate. They knew they had won only a battle, not the war. Xerxes had enough men to continue attacking for weeks, while the Greeks had only 7,000 defenders. It was a matter of brutal mathematics. Eventually, the Persian numbers would prevail. But that night, they had proven something important, that courage and skill could overcome overwhelming numbers, that one free man fighting for his home was stronger than 10 slaves fighting for conquest, and that the Greeks, when united, were a force to be reckoned with. The second day dawned with the same fierce determination on both sides. Xerxes, humiliated by the previous day's defeat, was even more determined to crush the Greeks. He couldn't simply retreat. His reputation as King of Kings was at stake. If he couldn't defeat a handful of Greeks, how could he claim to rule the greatest empire in the world? The attacks resumed with renewed fury. Xerxes varied his tactics, sending different contingents of his vast army: Carians, Cilicians, Sacae. Each group had its own fighting style, its own weapons, its own martial traditions. Xerxes hoped that this variety would eventually find a weakness in the Greek defense. But the phalanx held firm. The Spartans in the front line fought in carefully coordinated shifts. When one man tired, another immediately took his place, keeping the bronze wall intact. It was a deadly dance rehearsed 1,000 times in training, now executed with lethal perfection. The other Greeks, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Locrians, also fought with impressive bravery. Though not as trained as the Spartans, they were inspired by the courage of the red-robed warriors at their side. If 300 Spartans could face an empire, so could they. Leonidas demonstrated exemplary leadership. He didn't command from behind, protected by his men. He fought on the front lines, his red plume visible to all, inspiring his warriors with his presence. When a young soldier faltered, Leonidas was there. When a section of the line needed reinforcements, Leonidas personally led them. There is a story that during one of the battles, a Theban remarked to a Spartan, "The Persians are so numerous that their arrows will block out the sun." The Spartan, whose name was Dionysus, responded with typical Spartan dry humor. "So much the better. We'll fight in the shade." This wasn't empty bragging. The Persians did indeed launch massive barrages of arrows before each attack, literally darkening the sky. But the large Greek shields were specifically designed for protection against projectiles. The Spartans simply crouched behind their shields, let the arrows storm past, and then rose to face the melee attack that followed. As the second day progressed, something remarkable began to happen in the Persian army. Morale began to crack. Soldiers who had marched confidently into battle, certain of an easy victory, now hesitated before advancing. They had seen many of their comrades slaughtered in the narrow pass. They began to whisper among themselves about the Greeks being protected by the gods, about them being invincible demons disguised as men. Xerxes tried to motivate them with promises of riches and threats of punishment. Historical accounts suggest he even ordered soldiers whipped to force them forward, but no amount of threats could erase the primal terror of marching to almost certain death. As the second day ended, the situation was even more devastating for the Persians. Thousands of additional bodies littered the pass. The stench of death began to hang over the battlefield, and still the Greeks held their positions, seemingly unshaken. But despite their bravery, the Greeks were beginning to feel the weight of the battle. Men were wounded, tired, some had fallen. Their spears were broken, their shields dented from countless impacts. They knew they could not hold this indefinitely. It was then that betrayal changed everything. On the second night, a local Greek named Ephialtes sought out Xerxes. Motivated by promises of wealth and possibly resentment against his own countrymen, he revealed a crucial secret to the Persian king. There was a mountain trail called Thermopylae that skirted Thermopylae and emerged behind the Greek lines. It was exactly the information Xerxes needed. If he could send a force to flank the Greeks while keeping them busy with frontal attacks, he could completely surround them. The trap Leonidas had set for the Persians would be reversed. Xerxes immediately ordered Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, to lead a force through the mountain trail during the night. They would march in silence, reach the Greek rearguard by dawn, and crush the defenders between two armies. The trail was guarded by 1,000 Phocians, competent soldiers, but not on par with the Spartans. When they heard the Persians approaching in the early hours of the morning, they positioned themselves to defend the pass. But the Immortals did not attack. Instead, they simply fired a massive barrage of arrows and bypassed the Phocians, continuing on their way. The Phocians sent messengers running to warn Leonidas, but it was too late. The siege was closing in. When the news reached the Greek camp, panic set in among many of the allies. They had agreed to hold a pass, not to be surrounded and annihilated. Leonidas called a council of war. The situation was desperate. With the Persians closing in from both front and rear, there was no realistic hope of survival. The choice was clear: retreat now and preserve the army, or stay and die. Leonidas made one of the most famous decisions in military history. He dismissed most of the Greek allies, ordering them to return to their cities to continue the fight. Greece would need these men in future battles, but he and his 300 Spartans would stay. The 700 Thespians, too proud to retreat, also chose to stay, and the 400 Thebans were kept, possibly as hostages since Thebes had Persian sympathies. Why did Leonidas choose to stay? Some say it was because of a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi that predicted either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. Others argue it was purely tactical. Someone needed to delay the Persians as long as possible to give the other Greeks time to prepare. But perhaps the truer reason lay at the heart of Spartan culture. A Spartan never retreated, never surrendered. For Leonidas, dying in battle defending Greece was the highest destiny a warrior king could have. The third day dawned, with a heavy mist covering the pass, as if the gods themselves were drawing a veil over the tragedy about to unfold. Leonidas and his men knew this would be their last day on earth. There were no illusions of victory, no hope of rescue. There was only duty, honor, and the determination to make the Persians pay dearly for every inch of Greek land. The Spartans' preparation for this final day was different. There was no longer any need to conserve energy or maintain their equipment for future battles. They prepared like men who knew they were marching to their death, and embraced that fate. According to historical accounts, Leonidas gathered his men and said something that became legendary: "Eat your breakfast here, for tonight we dine in Hades." It was a crystal-clear statement of intent. They would fight to the last man, to their last breath. When the Persians launched their final attack, they encountered not a defensive force struggling to survive, but warriors who had accepted death and now fought with even greater ferocity. The Spartans didn't just hold their ground, they advanced. For the first time in the battle, Leonidas ordered his men to leave the relative comfort of their fortified positions and take the fight to the Persians in the wider part of the pass. It was a bold tactical shift. In more open terrain, the Persians had more room to maneuver, more opportunity to use their numbers. But Leonidas wanted to maximize enemy casualties before inevitable death struck. The Spartans cut through the Persian lines like a scythe through wheat. Their spears broke, so they used swords. Their swords broke, so they used their fists, teeth, anything. Each Spartan seemed worth 10 Persian men. Later, Persian accounts describe the terror the soldiers felt as they faced the Spartans on that final day. These were not men fighting to live. They were ghosts already dead, returning to take as many of their enemies with them as possible. And that made them utterly terrifying. It was during this fierce battle that Leonidas fell. The Spartan king, fighting on the front line as he always had, was surrounded and killed. His body immediately became the focus of a fierce struggle. The remaining Spartans rushed to recover their king's body. It was a matter of sacred honor not to leave their commander's body to the enemy. 4 times the Persians took Leonidas's body. 4 times the Spartans recovered it, fighting with a fury that defied reason. The area around the king's body became a meat grinder, with hundreds dying on both sides. Finally, the immortals, who had skirted the mountain trail, reached the Greek rearguard. The trap was complete. The remaining Spartans, now reduced to a few dozen, retreated to a small hill in the gorge, taking Leonidas's body with them. There, they made their last stand. Without spears, without swords, many without shields, they fought with stones, with their bare hands, with everything they had. The 700 Thespians fought and died alongside them to the last man, demonstrating that courage was not a Spartan monopoly. The 400 Thebans, seeing the situation hopeless, attempted to surrender. Some were accepted as prisoners, but many were killed even as they surrendered. The Persians were hungry for revenge after 3 days of humiliation. When the battle finally ended, when the last Spartan had fallen, the Persians had won, but it was a bitter victory. Xerxes had lost between 10,000 and 20,000 men, massive numbers even for his large army, and he had lost something perhaps more important, the aura of invincibility that surrounds a conqueror. In his anger and frustration, Xerxes committed an act that tarnished his reputation. He ordered Leonidas's body beheaded and crucified, a horrific desecration for the Greeks and an act considered barbaric even by Persian standards of the time. It demonstrated how deeply the Spartans had wounded him, not only militarily, but also in his pride. But Xerxes couldn't erase what had happened there. News of the heroic resistance spread like wildfire across Greece. Cities that were considering surrendering to the Persians suddenly found renewed courage. If 300 Spartans could face an entire empire, what could thousands of united Greeks do? After the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes continued his invasion of Greece. He marched south, sacked Athens, which had been evacuated, and seemed on the verge of conquering all of Greece. But something had fundamentally changed in the dynamics of the war. The Greeks, inspired by the sacrifice of Leonidas and his men, united as never before. The ancient rivalries between Sparta and Athens were temporarily set aside in the face of a common existential threat. And they had learned a crucial lesson. The Persians could be defeated. The resistance at Thermopylae had bought precious time. While the Persians were trapped in the pass for 3 days, the Greek fleet had fought parallel naval battles at Artemisium. Although technically inconclusive, these naval battles significantly damaged the Persian fleet and demonstrated that the Greeks could compete at sea. More importantly, the delay allowed the Greeks to evacuate Athens and prepare their final strategy. The Athenian general Themistocles convinced the Greeks to risk everything in a single major naval battle in the Straits of Salamis. In September 480 BC, just a month after Thermopylae, the Greek fleet met the Persian fleet at Salamis. Xerxes, confident of victory, sat on a golden throne on the shore to witness his final triumph. Instead, he witnessed disaster. The Greeks repeated Leonidas's strategy on a larger scale. They lured the vast Persian fleet into the Straits of Salamis, where the Persian ships could not maneuver properly. There, the heavier and better manned Greek ships devastated the enemy fleet. It was a decisive victory that changed the course of the war. Xerxes, fearing being trapped in Greece with his supply lines cut, retreated to Asia, leaving an army under Mardonius to complete the conquest. The following year, in 479 BC, that army was utterly destroyed at the Battle of Plataea, coincidentally led by a Spartan king, Pausanias. The Persian invasion had failed. Greece was saved. And it all began with the impossible resistance of 300 Spartans in a narrow pass. But the true legacy of Thermopylae goes far beyond military history. The Greeks immediately recognized the significance of what had happened. They erected a monument on the battlefield with the famous inscription written by the poet Simonides. "O stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that here we lie, obeying their words." It was simple, direct, and perfectly Spartan. No bluster, no exaggeration, just the fact that they had done their duty unto death. Thermopylae became an enduring symbol of courage against impossible odds, of sacrifice for the greater good, of small groups determined to face overwhelming forces. The story has been told and retold through the centuries, inspiring countless generations. For Western civilization, Thermopylae represents a pivotal moment. Had the Greeks been conquered, the entire trajectory of Western history would have been different. Athenian democracy, still in its infancy, would have been crushed. Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, might never have flourished. The Renaissance, centuries later, which relied heavily on the rediscovery of Greek texts, might never have happened. It's fascinating to think that the modern world as we know it owes something to the 300 Spartans who died in that gorge over 2,400 years ago. History also teaches us timeless lessons about leadership. Leonidas didn't ask his men to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. He led by example, fighting on the front lines, sharing every danger and hardship. This kind of inspiring leadership breeds loyalty and courage that no amount of orders can match. There's also a lesson about the value of preparation and training. The Spartans weren't superhumans. They were men who had dedicated their entire lives to perfecting the art of war. When the time came to put that training to the test, they were ready. In any field of endeavor, be it war, sports, business, or art, the difference between the amateur and the master is often simply preparation and dedication. Thermopylae also demonstrates the importance of strategy over brute force. Xerxes had the largest army, the best weapons, and virtually unlimited resources. But Leonidas had something better, a plan that turned the enemy's strength into weakness. He chose the battlefield carefully, denied the enemy the ability to use their numbers, and fought on their own terms. Today, Thermopylae still exists as a physical site in Greece, though much changed by time. The coast has receded due to sedimentation, and the once narrow gorge is now a wider plain, but the monument still stands, reminding visitors of what happened at that sacred place. In modern Sparta, there is a statue of Leonidas that perfectly captures the warrior spirit he represented. He stands in a fighting stance, shield raised, spear ready, staring defiantly forward. It is impossible to look at that statue and not feel the weight of history, the sacrifice of those men. The story of Thermopylae has been adapted countless times in books, films, plays, and art. The 2006 film 300, though dramatized and historically inaccurate in many ways, introduced the story to a new generation and kept the memory of those warriors alive. The image of the Spartans as supreme warriors is etched in the global popular imagination. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the legacy of Thermopylae is what it tells us about human nature. Faced with certain death, these men did not flee. They did not beg for mercy, they did not surrender. Instead, they chose to face their fate with honor, fight for what they believed in, and make their last stand mean something. This story resonates with us because it touches something deep in the human condition. We all face our own battles, perhaps not against Persian armies, but against adversity, fear, and obstacles that seem insurmountable. The story of Leonidas and his 300 reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite fear. It teaches us that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the hard thing, that there are causes worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible, that a small group of determined people can make a difference against much greater forces. Thermopylae also reminds us of the cost of freedom, democracy, individual rights, the ability to live freely. These things are neither natural nor guaranteed. They exist because, at crucial moments in history, people chose to fight for them. They paid with their blood so that future generations could live in freedom. It's easy, living in modern democratic societies, to forget this cost. We take our freedoms for granted, failing to consider how many sacrifices were necessary over the centuries to create the world we live in. Thermopylae is a powerful reminder of this sacrifice. There is also a fascinating historical irony. The Spartans fought and died to preserve the Greek way of life, including Athenian democracy. Yet Sparta itself was a militaristic oligarchy, not a democracy. They stood for something they themselves didn't fully practice. This reminds us that even imperfect societies can produce moments of transcendent heroism. Sparta itself eventually declined and disappeared, conquered first by Thebes, then by Macedonia, and finally absorbed into the Roman Empire. But the memory of what the Spartans represented, discipline, courage, sacrifice, never died. Thermopylae ensured that, even after Sparta itself had crumbled to dust, the Spartans would live forever in human memory. Also worth mentioning are the 700 Thespians who stayed and died alongside the Spartans. They received less attention in popular history, but their courage was no less. They lacked the Spartans' lifelong training. They lacked the culture that glorified death in battle. They were ordinary citizens of a small town who chose to stay because it was the right thing to do. In some ways, their sacrifice was even more remarkable. The story of Thermopylae also raises profound philosophical questions. Leonidas knew he and his men would die. Was this a genuine last stand, or was it essentially tactical suicide? From a purely military perspective, was it the right choice? We could argue that preserving these elite warriors for future battles would have been more strategically sensible. But this cold analysis misses the point. Sometimes the value of an action goes beyond its immediate utility. The resistance at Thermopylae had a psychological and moral impact that was as important as any military impact. It inspired Greece, demonstrated the vulnerability of the Persians, and created a symbol of resistance that would resonate through the centuries. In our modern era, we continue to see echoes of Thermopylae. Whenever a small group faces a larger force for a cause they believe in, comparisons to the 300 Spartans are inevitable. From resistance movements against occupations to sports teams overcoming impossible odds, the narrative of Thermopylae is reenacted again and again. This speaks to the enduring power of a good story. But Thermopylae is more than a good story. It is true history. These people really lived, really fought, really died. The Persians did indeed bring a massive army. The confrontation really happened. The details may be debated by historians, but the essential core is real. And perhaps that's what makes the story so powerful. It's not a myth or legend, though it has mythical qualities. It's a reminder that real history sometimes produces moments as extraordinary as any fiction. So, when we remember Thermopylae, what exactly are we remembering? We're remembering that courage isn't the exclusive property of muscular warriors in red capes. It's a quality we can all cultivate. We're remembering that doing the right thing often requires sacrifice. We're remembering that small, determined groups can make a difference. We're remembering that there are moments in history when the choices of a few people shape the fate of entire civilizations. And we're remembering that, even facing certain death, human beings are capable of extraordinary greatness. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans didn't just face 100,000 Persians. They faced their own mortality and chose to make it an act of meaning. They transformed their deaths into something immortal. More than 2 millennia later, we still talk about them. We still draw inspiration from them. We still learn from them. And perhaps this is the ultimate victory. Xerxes conquered the past, but Leonidas conquered immortality. The Persian Empire, once the greatest in the world, eventually fell and disappeared. But Leonidas's name, the sacrifice of the 300, the resistance at Thermopylae, this lives on forever. When you visit Thermopylae today, you can stand where those men fought and died. You can touch the monument erected in their memory. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clash of bronze against bronze, the battle cries, the rhythmic march of the Spartan phalanx. But most importantly, you can sense the presence of something greater, the human spirit at its highest, refusing to bow, choosing honor over survival, turning a last stand into an eternal triumph. This is the story of how 300 Spartans faced 100,000 Persians. But it is also the story of how courage can overcome numbers, how sacrifice can inspire nations, and how some moments in history shine so brightly that their light never dims. Leonidas and his men went to Thermopylae knowing they would die, but they also knew their death would mean something, and 2,500 years later, it still does. It still inspires. It still reminds us of what human beings are capable of when they face adversity with unwavering courage. This is the true victory of Thermopylae, not a military victory, but a victory of the human spirit that can never be defeated, no matter how many armies march against it. The Spartans left us a legacy that transcends battles and empires. They showed us that true strength lies not merely in muscles or weapons, but in character, in discipline, in the will to defend principles even when the cost is supreme. Today, when we face our own challenges, be they personal, professional, or collective, we can look back to that narrow gorge in ancient Greece and find inspiration. We can remember that 300 men faced the impossible, and though they fell, they were never defeated. Thermopylae teaches us that defeat and failure are not the same thing. One can lose a battle and still win the war. One can fall and still remain standing in the memories and spirits of all those who come after. This is the ultimate lesson of Thermopylae, that some things are worth more than life itself, that honor, courage, and duty are not empty words, but principles worth fighting for, and, if necessary, dying for. That a handful of good men fighting for the right cause can change the world. And as long as there are people who remember the story of Leonidas and his 300, as long as there are those who are inspired by the sacrifice of Thermopylae, the spirit of those ancient warriors will never die. They fought more than 2 millennia ago, but their battle still echoes through time, reminding us of who we can be in our finest moments, courageous, honorable, unwavering in the face of adversity. This is the eternal victory of Thermopylae, and that is why the story of the 300 Spartans will never be forgotten.